Okay, let's get started. Welcome to our webinar. Bright Arrow's sponsored topic this week is Think Like a CEO, How to Unify Your Executive Team. I'm your host today, and we will have a couple of other coaches joining us in a moment. I'm Tegan Travato. I'm the CEO and founder of Bright Arrow Coaching. I also happen to be the mother to a really awesome 4-year-old named Athena. And a fun fact about me is I have lived in 8 states and 13 cities in my lifetime. A fun fact about Bright Arrow is our mission. So for those of you who don't know us, we were founded with the intention to help create a more abundant and equitable world because of great leaders. I mentioned I'm a mother to a 4-year-old, and I do really imagine on a regular basis the kind of workplace she will come into in the next couple of decades. And as someone who's benefited so much from my experience at work over the years, and now as a CEO and founder, I'm very intentional about the kind of workplace I want to create for our future children, but also how we want to experience it today. And so that is how Bright Arrow was born. We focus on executive coaching and leadership team coaching. And the topic we brought forward today is simply here because we are asked about it so much. So here's what it sounds like with our clients. They will often come to us and say, executive teams will say, how do I learn to think more like our CEO? Like, I'm trying to guess what it is he or she wants. I'm trying this, I'm trying that. It doesn't seem to be working. What I'm trying to express is not landing. I don't feel aligned. I often will have CEOs come to me and say, how do I get my executive team to think more like me so they don't always need me in the room to make big decisions? So what's fascinating to us is that all parties in the team are asking for the same thing. How do we learn to think most like or like our most senior leader? And so today we want to demystify, if you will, what it is that the CEO is constantly thinking about, and how executives can learn to think more like them, and vice versa, really making sure that the CEO is able to tap into the wisdom of their team. So over the next hour, I'm going to share a bit of research that we base our work on, a bit of anecdotal evidence, and sort of a radical version of the definition of enterprise leadership that our team has refined over the years in our work with executive teams. And after I share some of that, I'm going to welcome 2 of our top coaches to our webinar and allow them to share their insights and wisdom and stories with you as well, to help really bring some of the topical components to life for you today. So let's talk first at a foundational level about what the CEO mindset is. So there is an article that was published many years ago by the former P&G CEO, A.G. Lafley. And the topic of the article is what only the CEO can do. And a lot of the CEOs I work with focus their work on these very 4 things. And they reference this article. It's sort of like a rite of passage that you end up inheriting this article, the CEO world at some point. But there are 4 main areas or 4 main responsibilities that only the CEO can do. One is that they have to define and interpret the meaningful outside. And what the meaningful outside is, as you may imagine, social structures, social trends, economic trends and variables, industry trends, general macro and microeconomics, a lot of data outside of the organization that would naturally then impact the organization. So it's not just any old information. Notice it says meaningful outside. And what's tricky is it's the CEO's job to determine what is going on in the ecosystem that is meaningful to their organization in particular. The CEO's job is to name what business they're in and what business they're not in. So any of you who've worked in the executive suite or close to it probably have heard the phrase shiny penny syndrome. And a lot of CEOs can become notorious for having shiny penny syndrome because the newest, coolest thing that looks promising may distract their attention. But healthy CEOs are keeping an eye out for, yes, this is a thing we do, or no, this is something we don't do. We're going to stay focused on these particular things. And it takes a lot of intestinal fortitude to be able to name that to the boards and to employees who may have differing opinions. A third thing the CEO is responsible for doing, and that only they can do, is to balance the yield today with investing in the future. So short-term gains and goals must be met. And they're sort of placing bets that may not pay off for years when it comes to investing in the future. No pressure, right? And finally, they shape the organization's values and standards. Of course, it is also the broader C-suites and leadership's job across the organization to work in concert to make sure that the organization's values and standards are both created and upheld. But it is ultimately the CEO's job to ensure that those things are in place, being monitored, cared for, and nurtured. So all of this is table stakes. And I mentioned that, this research and this article has been around for, maybe 15 years. It's been around a while, and it's still proving to be true. What CEOs often also constantly have to weather is what's going on today. So if we look at what's going on in 2024 and overlay that with all the responsibilities I just shared, CEOs are facing a litany of challenges, and we really love the Conference Board's annual report. They survey thousands of CEOs globally, and then they do regional slices of data. And the top challenges for US-based CEOs externally is that they're thinking about the impacts of a potential economic downturn, inflation, and the rapid advancement of AI. And that's just their top 3. There are 10 listed in the survey if you care to go back and review it. But for me, what we've noticed is that CEOs are needing to hold on to their cash longer, really trying to be more conservative about where they're spending this year, just trying to, again, make short-term decisions that yield long-term gains, and trying to be safe and balancing the ambiguity. The rapid advancement of AI. Hot topic. Most organizations already have some version of AI inside of their organization. What makes this an external challenge for CEOs is that there's no legislation around this yet. We aren't really sure of the level of privacy we have when we enter information into various forms of AI. So they're having to monitor that meaningful outside for landmark legislation, trends, and balance the interests of their board stakeholders in investing in AI. So I'm calling out and going a little deeper in some of these because when we see just a few things listed, it doesn't look so heavy. But when you really peel back the layers of the external challenges, they are rich and they are sophisticated. And the level of ambiguity the CEO has to navigate, we can't really quantify. It's really unparalleled compared to how it's been in previous years. The internal challenges that they're facing, and these are their top challenges for 24, attracting and retaining talent. They are focused on improving the customer experience. So that's also, of course, customer attraction and retention. And they have a focus on improving product / service and innovation. What I want you to notice is that ideally the CEO is thinking about both external and internal challenges and in a very balanced way. And that is what we refer to in our work as enterprise thinking. So there's a more traditional approach to enterprise thinking, which is defining it as thinking for the enterprise first, thinking about the absolute end goal as the priority. What we at Bright Arrow are positing is that really healthy executives balance enterprise thinking and their functional thinking or their function-centric thinking. And we're going to go a couple layers deeper in what that means, what those behaviors are, what it looks if you over-index or under-index in certain areas. So again, if you go Googling enterprise thinking, it's going to focus on only enterprise level information, decision-making, priorities. But what we know for certain is that we still need our executive teams to anchor in their function-centric knowledge, expertise, and wisdom, and balance that with what's going on across the broader organization. The CEOs need that from our executive team leaders. So enterprise thinkers connect the dots, they collaborate across the business, and they advocate for issues outside of their specific focus areas. Here's the kicker. Korn Ferry has new research that tells us that only 14% of executives can be considered enterprise leaders. And this is the painful part for me. That includes CEOs. So I found that really shocking and illuminating. And it made me really curious about how is it that even our CEOs, the most brilliant leaders, ideally in our organization, who are, plugged into the outside, anchored into the inside, balancing both of those worlds, how are they missing the mark on enterprise leadership? And that is where we really came to understand the need to balance both in order to be an enterprise leader. And we're going to talk about those in just a minute. So when it comes to typical behaviors and outcomes for each, I want you as viewers and listeners to anchor into some of these definitions. So if we are thinking as a functional leader, we're thinking for our function. And what I mean by that is if you lead finance, you're thinking about finance. If you're the COO, you're thinking about, how the organization's operating, efficiencies, et cetera. And so our execs who think more for the function are anchoring into that sphere of influence and trying to operate from that source, from their functional area. They drive results from that function and primarily for that function. They may focus their efforts and advocacy on that functional area most of the time, if not all the time. And in those rooms where we have executives who are thinking more like a collective of functional leaders, they often view their other peers as competitors rather than collaborators. And that is a problem, as we know, and it's very common. On the other side of the coin, if we think about the behaviors of an enterprise thinker, you're typically wanting to drive performance and transformation at the same time, ideally for both your functional area and the ecosystem, the broader ecosystem. Functional or enterprise thinkers tend to, when they're in collaboration, deliver a unique value stream. So what I mean by that is, the CEO has his or her value stream. Your functional leaders, supervisors have their value stream. In the middle is the C-suite of really brilliant leaders who, if they can learn to collaborate, deliver even more value than was ever expected or imagined. That's why we emphasize the need to balance the two worlds. Enterprise thinkers may prioritize system performance and then look to their functional areas to kind of back into it. But when we have a true enterprise thinking executive team, the team appears as aligned and impenetrable to the broader business. This is the phrase we use as often, that they lock arms really well when they're facing the broader enterprise. So, part of the point of our webinar today was to help you start thinking about how do we align an executive team? How do we get them to start rowing in the same direction and be accountable to similar things? And the first place we go when we work with executive teams is to help them think about what are they thinking about, decide what they need to think about, and then decide and commit to how they will think about it. It sounds a bit abstract at the moment. Going to take you a level deeper with our coaches here in a minute, our guests, to help bring that to life a little bit more. So with that, I want to welcome to our call Keisha and Cara. And once they join us on stage, I'll have them introduce themselves to you and share a fun fact as well. So Cara and Keisha, welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to join me today and imparting your wisdom and your stories to our audience.
Awesome. I'm so excited to be here today. So I'll just go off and kick off, introduce myself a little bit. I am Keisha, one of the executive and leadership team coaches here with Bright Arrow. I live in a tiny state called Connecticut in Stamford. I like to say that we are the forgotten state in the New York tri-state area. And I've been working in HR. Actually, my background is about 20 years of working in corporate HR with Fortune 500 companies. And I really focus on my work with Bright Arrow and helping leaders and teams take their effectiveness to the next level. I also love to specialize for those that are below the C-suite in helping to demystify what it takes to get to the C-suite. One fun fact about me is that I love to travel, but I try to make my travel experiences fun by picking a place I don't speak the language and try for a couple months to learn the language. Sometimes I do it very well, sometimes I fail.
That is exciting. I actually didn't know that about you, Keisha. How have I missed this over the years?
I really, I was like, oh, you know what? I just thought about this. Yeah, I really love to do this. So yeah.
That is amazing and doesn't surprise me with your fearlessness. So thank you for sharing. Cara.
Awesome. Hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Cara Wilson. I live in a little town on the Washington State Peninsula called Paulsbo, and I live on a blueberry farm. And I'm almost 20 years into doing this work of coaching, leadership development, organizational development. I have almost a decade in healthcare and then a similar amount of time working inside of tech. And I am also a Bright Arrow coach. New fun fact about me, I just last night got home from a 5-day motorcycle trip into northeastern Oregon, into the Wallowa Mountains, which are amazing. And I learned how to pick up my 500-pound motorcycle from the ground after dropping it. I dropped it on purpose so that I could learn.
Okay.
And it's all about leverage. Like, you can do it. You can actually pick up a 500-pound motorcycle. Amazing.
Okay. There's a deeper life lesson in this, but we'll put that in a box for later. As a coach, I can't help but see a great life parallel to that. So well done, Cara. All right. Well, thank you. I'm actually, going to turn it over to you, Cara, to talk about something that's near and dear to your heart. And that is polarities. And for those of you listening, before I have Cara teach us about this, she is teaching our coaches about this because it is such a powerful framework. Since meeting Cara, I have become really aware of how many polarities exist in my life and the opportunity that they all present. So Cara, with that, thank you for, first of all, illuminating enterprise and functional thinking as a polarity for us. This was your genius. And please share with our audience, number one, what it is, polarity, generically speaking, and then take us into the deeper levels of the functional versus enterprise.
Yeah, sure. So a polarity is a pair of interdependent characteristics that are both needed over time. If we think about breathing, inhaling and exhaling, that's actually a polarity. If we think about talking and listening, that's a polarity. You can't really do only one of those things and not the other one and still be kind of healthy functioning, especially with the breathing one. So polarity is this idea. It's a way that we can actually manage complexity in our brain by recognizing the both and of something. So if we look at polarities in terms of functional and enterprise being a polarity, and we look over here on the left side with functional thinking, and we think about there are upsides to functional thinking. And those upsides to functional thinking are a lot of the things that Tegan's already been talking about. It's being connected with our direct reports within our specific function, being able to drive results for our function, and being able really to drive things around the present. If that's all we ever do, to the exclusion of enterprise thinking, then we might run into the downside of this, right? We might be missing that enterprise view. We might be missing key outside factors that are impacting or affecting the business. And it potentially leads us to overvalue autonomous leadership. So what's interesting here is that the stronger the value or preference you have for functional thinking, the higher your tolerance for this downside quadrant. But with polarities, the thing that will actually keep this in check and keep us functioning in that upper quadrant is to bring in enterprise thinking, because we know that the upsides of enterprise thinking are these things that, again, Tegan has been talking about already around systems thinking, balancing of the present and the future, and being able to drive performance and transformation. But if that's all we ever did was enterprise thinking and ignored the function, then we potentially would be lacking structured execution. We would potentially be lacking buy-in from our team because they would see us as like out in the world and totally disconnected from the real view of the work that's being done. And I think one other thing I might say about this is that we all have preferences usually. So if you can look at these two and think about where your preferences lie, whichever one is your preferred is likely the one that you would overdo. So ideally with polarities, because we never solve them, they're not problems to be fixed, they're just to be managed. We're finding a nice flow between the two where we're doing both things.
I really appreciate the point of where we would tend to over-index. So what comes up for me, and tell me if I'm getting it, Cara, is that, for me, in my experience, our more senior executives will tend towards the upper right. They love the visionary part. They love the bigger view of how things connect. They like to look far into the future. They don't necessarily like to bolt things down and anchor them down into the weeds to make sure that the vision is operational or feasible. But what you're suggesting is that there's some level of them that's conscious of that, so that they will take that infinity loop ride into the other side of functional thinking and make sure they're cross-checking for the things they don't necessarily love.
Yeah, and ideally we would have some early warning signs of overdoing it on one side or the other. That would be kind of your flag that it's time to do a little bit of course correcting or bringing the other side in.
Okay.
When we like a thing, we just want to do more of it. And that's like the gist, is that we like something, so we think, well, I'll just beat it to death and I'll be in good shape.
Yeah.
That's not actually how polarities work.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Okay. Well, let's stay with this a minute. And I'm going to leave this slide up just for our audience to be able to just keep connecting with it a bit before I take it down. But I'd like to ask each of you, Cara and Keisha, I'll have you go first here. Maybe you could share a story of an executive leader or an executive team who you saw do a good job of balancing the two. Let's start with the positive.
Yeah. In one of the organizations I coached with, I had a leader that he was in the finance function, and obviously he came with that deep domain expertise in finance, and he was really focused a lot on what the function was to increase profitability through cost savings. And that was what they were known for, his entire team. But he also had this broader perspective and was able to think from an enterprise level. So when you think about the system, thinking about what's going on inside and outside of the organization, he modeled that very well in terms of, first of all, bringing to the awareness of his team the broader context in which they were operating. So when he went to the cross-functional, the senior leadership team meeting, coming back with the deck and sharing them the broader context of how the work that they were doing was the interdependencies across the different functions, and really helping them to connect the dots around that. Also, from an outside of the organization, and I know a lot of leaders or a lot of you probably will identify with this, a lot of us in organization, we tend to be very myopic and internally focused because there's just so much to do. And a lot of times like, well, who has time to think about all the other things that's going on outside? I have enough that's going on inside to think about. And he created that space for himself to be an avid reader of Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times. I think he spent a lot of time, watching CNBC and coming back and actually talking to the team about, well, this is what's happening in the market. These things are tightening up. And so we should be thinking about, how can we collaborate with the team to the other functions to think about how can we bring in, for example, additional sales from another area of the business because we expect this aspect or this market, this product to dry up a bit. And so the impact of that with his thinking is that, one, he built capacity in his team to think outside of the box beyond just cost savings, but looking at other things that they could bring innovative ideas on how they could bring in additional revenue by working with sales, or even around research and development, for example, not just cost saving, but how can we invest more in additional products that's going to bring in more revenue long-term for the organization. And so it broadened the understanding of the team, built capacity for them. It impacted him in a positive way because personally, his career was skyrocketed because the leaders began to think of him as the enterprise thinker. And now he becomes this, not just this data manager or cost manager, but really that strategic business partner and that valued consultant that can really bring additional insights outside of what you would traditionally think of the finance leader being able to do.
That is a juicy example. As you were describing some of this guy's behaviors, I am thinking of CEOs I've coached. That's exactly what we're trying to get to, right? Like looking outside at those meaningful external factors, thinking about what it means in this case to his function. And then I love that you brought up interdependencies here, that he wasn't just staying in his lane, but I'm assuming in a very partnering kind of way, letting his tentacles, if you will, out into the organization to probe for opportunities. And that's exactly what a CEO is doing, right? Externally, and then hoping also internally his team's doing that, or that her team is thinking that way for him or her. So.
And I will say, I think this exposure is really important, because as I sat down and thought back to this example again, like, why did he come in with this, this ability to think on an enterprise level? I think two reasons. Well, the avid curiosity. We talk about curiosity as coaches, like super curious, and that hunger for learning. And so he was going out there doing reading, et cetera. And then, the privilege for him is that he was also brought up in a home where his dad, I think, was an entrepreneur. So in a way, he already had that in him. And so how do we as leaders begin to expose ourselves to some of the things that maybe we didn't have the same opportunity that he had?
Oh, so thinking strategically even about our capabilities or how we build them.
Yes.
Love it. And it's so interesting that a quality like curiosity, which we wouldn't call a skill, we'd call it a quality, really builds skill. So excellent example. Thank you for that. I'm going to come back to you in a minute to hear about where things maybe have been over-indexed and some examples you might have, Keisha.
Sure.
But Cara, can we come to you next to hear from you about either an executive or a leadership team who embodied a good balance between the polarities?
Yeah, I think about a large software company that I worked with, and I worked with the chief trust officer and their security leadership team. And this team was tasked with keeping the company safe and keeping the product safe. And so the requirement for them to be monitoring the external environment, external threats, as well as evolving technologies, and then be able to take what they were learning in the environment and turn it around and implement solutions that would keep the company safe I found it remarkable. When I learned what their work looked like, I actually thought I was going to lose sleep, because I thought about what a stressful role that was.
In terms of what they were responsible for protecting and guarding against?
Yeah, the vigilance required, I thought was pretty incredible. And sometimes there's something about the sense of urgency that will get people dialed in that way. And they really were dialed in, both internally and externally.
Wow. Okay, great example. I appreciate also your call out around how important the work is there in a time that is all about high security, but arguably so many functions could relate to that level of pressure and ambiguity right now just because of the way the world is. So nice side point that's coming out of that for me. Keisha, if we come back to you, tell us about a team that may be over-indexed in one area or another.
Yeah, this is more around the operational side. So I was coaching this person that was in a chief operating officer role, and they became so narrowly focused on ensuring that there was efficiencies and operations, rather than thinking big and broad, just being very narrow focused. And to that person's, and I'm sure a lot of you will really identify with this, to that person's credit, there was just so much on the plate to get done. And I don't know if you've ever felt like you're in a situation where you're consistently outing fires. Who has time to go deep and be strategic? I'm just trying to survive here, right? And so for this person, it wasn't her inability to think strategically or to think on an enterprise level. It's just really being in the survival mode that caused. But how did this impact her ability to be the right-hand partner of the CEO, which is what the CEO wanted from her? She wasn't able to. She wasn't able to connect those dots. She wasn't able to even communicate in a way that was impactful and understanding. So we think about executive level communications. We hear a lot about executive presence. She would go and she would present to peers, et cetera. And she wouldn't come in with the enterprise level thinking. She wouldn't come into the so what, what's the ask, because she was so deep. She gave a lot of details and her communication was ineffective and really lost the points she was trying to bring across, because she spent all of her time in the weeds and wasn't spending enough time at this higher level, or at least connecting the dots across the different areas. And so as we work together, first of all, when you're able to think on the what, the so what, the interconnectedness, it really helps you decide what I call PDE, what to prioritize. What are the most important areas that if you focus on, this 20% of these efforts are going to give you the 80% impact? What can I delegate to somebody else because this is not my area of genius that I'm operating in? And then what's really actually not the priority and not important, and we can eliminate it. And so by doing that, she then created the space, and then she was able to communicate more effectively, bring bigger impact to the organization through her work, and then also, allow her team, raise her team up at a higher level to be able to contribute in that way as well.
If people were listening closely, they just got hot coaching tips from you on how they can level up. So the specificity in that example was great, Keisha. Thanks. As you're sharing, what comes up for me is how often we've been in room with entire executive teams who are operating with that franticness. And there is little agenda. What agenda there is, to your point, using your language, is firefighting. So you're listening today and you're wondering how to level up your senior leadership team. You could start by examining your agenda for functional and enterprise thinking and really questioning if you're creating the conditions that allow for the balance, because the example Keisha gave exemplifies what we see a lot, which is the conditions weren't in place for this leader to thrive or to think beyond the firefighting. And boy, I know everybody listening can relate to the firefighting. So the challenge is to break out of our own habits, right? And stop that pattern, which you gave some great examples for. Thanks, Keisha. Cara, how about you? What example would you give from your real life of where a team or leader has over-indexed in one area of the polarity? And I'm going to stop sharing the screen now so everyone can see everyone closely when we talk. Go ahead.
I think about a software company where I worked, where the CEO was so focused on getting ahead of whatever the next thing was that was out in the environment to capitalize on, would kind of grab onto that thing, bring it back, and then pull this giant company into a sometimes 180-degree pivot. Wow. So the focus was so heavily on external forces and lacking on the actual execution. And the short attention span of this leader led to a culture of people feeling like they shouldn't commit wholeheartedly to initiatives, because if you just wait long enough, the next thing is going to come along and we're going to have to do another wild pivot. So it led, in a weird way, this like hyper adaptability led to this sense of inertia. It was a frustrating place to be.
Yeah, I bet. Wow. And so would you put them in the overused lower right quadrant of enterprise thinking then? Okay. Yep. Lack of structured execution, lack of buy-in from the leader's team, and out of touch with the broader business to true potential and capabilities, right?
Yeah.
So if the business never gets to fully deliver on its objectives, we don't really know if it ever could. So that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Do either of you have other examples before I move on? I don't want to miss out on the gold you've brought.
I think Dennis, if I could take one second to answer Dennis's question as it related to the example that I shared, that talks about if you spend more time in consistently outing these fires, consistently working in this urgent area that is also important, if we see that expand. And I say absolutely yes, because if you think about that, that matrix, that's a really popular matrix that talks about urgent, not urgent, and that's quadrant 1 and 2 versus important, not important. And so the more you're spending time in the areas that are not urgent, but very important, it actually reduces the urgent and important category, because the fire goes down and down and down. And so, but by only focusing on this urgent and important, you're not thinking proactively about addressing the topics before they become as important and urgent. So it's rebalancing where you spend time in the quadrants.
That's great. Hi, Dennis. Thanks for joining, by the way. Nice to see you. What comes up for me too, Keisha, is when we all rush to the fire, what do we stop seeing? Like, we just miss everything else. Everything else gets backburnered, often without any analysis about which quadrant the issues live in. So, and I love to encourage executive teams to do retrospectives each quarter on, like, where did we spend our time? What did we miss? What keeps coming up for us thematically as a leadership team, as an organization? What does it mean for the next quarter? And then also annually taking a look back to help us really, perhaps, to Kara's point, stop spinning 180 to go do something and getting clear that we sometimes keep addressing the same thing over and over again because we're not being conscious about it. So, such a great example. Thank you, Keisha and Kara. Well, I want to move us into some questions that I've formulated for each of you about how we can help unify the executive team and just some of the things that CEOs and executive teams might be thinking about. So the first question I would ask of each of you, and maybe Kara, I'll have you answer first. How does thinking like the CEO, which in this case we're going to say means balancing functional and enterprise thinking, how does it affect organization level outcomes in your experience?
When a team is doing this enterprise thinking and they're balancing it with functional thinking, it's like the opposite. When it's the opposite of the example I just got. Mm-hmm. So a team would have the ability to see what's happening outside and then to respond to it inside and get to see the results of that. A team is, I just think about how leadership teams function, and the example that you gave in the beginning around, is a team competing with each other, or are they collaborating with each other and kind of utilizing each other's strengths and growing in that way?
Yeah, beautiful. Keisha, how about for you? What are the outcomes you typically see at the organization level?
It goes back to some of the examples that I saw before. Teams are working much more collaboratively, which allows them to come up with innovative solutions around, if everybody is thinking about their own functional area and not understanding how everything interplays, by actually working together, the diversity of thought that's in the room allows you to create that innovation and come up with solutions that you would never come up alone when you're only thinking about what you normally do solely within your function. So the synergy that's created is amazing.
Yeah. Gosh, what came up for me as each of you were answering this question is, that most things seek equilibrium. Just not in nature, we seek balance. And when things are out of balance, we experience dis-ease or disease in a physical state, right? So what comes up for me when we think about balancing functional and enterprise thinking is health, just real organizational health, financially, in terms of achievement. Our humans are happier, like we're balancing innovation with what we know we need to root in, and thorough perspective, right? So, because if we're only looking through one lens on one side of that quadrant, we can't see the other half of the world, of our world. So that balance and health come up for me too there. So
I love that. I would expand on that, because you talked about that at the organization level, and I'm going to actually bring that to the personal level, since we're looking at the balance of each. Is the example I gave before. I didn't talk about how you can imagine this person was very close to burnout. Mm-hmm. And so by not having that balance, it was just work more, work harder, but you're not getting the impact that you want. And at some point, there's a diminishing return on how hard, the results you get from how hard you work. And so the health also is on a personal level as leaders and CEOs to stop us from, where a lot of studies are showing that leaders and C-suite executives are getting to the burnout level. It's the health personally as well as the organizational level.
Thank you for bringing us into that and pulling that thread through, Keisha. I feel like that was meant to be. So, well, for each of you, especially for our listeners and viewers, I think it would be nice if we could help them really imagine how it is that we can develop a better balance between our functional and enterprise thinking. So if you put yourself in the CEO's shoes, whose job it is primarily to help teach people to think like him or her, what are some of the tactical things that they could be challenging their leaders with to help them learn to think more like them?
So I'll start with one example. I love how you said teach. How can the CEO teach the team, their functional leaders, to think like them? It's, first of all, again, building on the examples that I said before, it's ensuring, first of all, that you're modeling the enterprise thinking, right? Most CEOs, right? Your study said 14% of CEOs,
all executives,
think at that enterprise level. And most CEOs are coming in with a specific background, a functional background, where, whether or not it's sales or whatever other function they're coming from. And, sometimes we default, especially under stress, to our old habits. So ensuring that as the leader, you're modeling what it looks like to be an enterprise thinker. Which means, if we put in the context of the work we do at Bright Arrow and we coach leaders and organizations, like that high level, big picture, have you created a clear, compelling purpose for the team? Are they grounded in this purpose? And so it eliminates this confusion where the HR and the finance person is fighting on what they think is a priority because you have the center, which has been communicated. And so once that clarity is in place, now you're able to say to your team, okay, these are the key things that are important to me. These are the things that are keeping me up at night. And I came to this decision based on a problem that I was facing based on this context. You give them the broader context. So you're doing some teaching. But to your point, after a while, you don't want to consistently be telling them what to do. And so this is where you begin to develop the skill as a leader to coach your team. So now, as new examples come up, you say to the person you're mentoring or your team or to your team as a whole, like, how would you address this situation if you were me? And you're asking them those powerful questions and helping to build capacity and that independent thinking, that enterprising thinking in them, so that over time, you're coaching them, you're mentoring them, you're helping them get up to speed, and over time they're able to adjust based on the teaching and based on the coaching. And so it's modeling it, it's setting the vision, the compelling purpose, and then it's also utilizing coaching skills to help build capacity in them.
Beautiful. Thank you, Keisha. Cara, what would you add to that? I love your smile already. I know you're cooking up something over there.
Well, I know. I was like, well, Keisha's like running down the list.
She's got it.
Yeah. No, it's great. So I just get to sit here and go, it makes me think about that adage that your system is designed to get the results that it's getting. So if you're not pleased with that, how are things set up in a way that you're getting results that you don't necessarily want? So how are you running your meetings? Like, what kinds of conversations are you asking of your team? How are you asking them to work together? This is, I think, where coaching can be so helpful. Team coaching can be so helpful because you have an outside perspective, somebody who knows what to be watching for, knows where to push and nudge and prod and invite, and just putting attention, like, very first thing, go back to your next team meeting and say, how does everybody think we're doing with this?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about how we balance these two things. What grade would you all give us in doing this? What makes it a B and not an A? And what would make it an A? Or, just opening the discussion in that way, I think, could be helpful.
Love that. I'm going to actually keep following that thread on how executive team coaching supports the development of enterprise thinking and balancing those polarities. Before we do, though, Dennis has another awesome question here. And his question is, what have you found is the best way to strike the balance between the CEO teaching others to think like them and the expectation, which is often unintentional, of reading the CEO's mind?
I need to hear it one more time.
Yeah. What have you found is the best way to strike the balance between the CEO teaching others to think like them and the expectation that they're reading the CEO's mind?
I think, each person on your team is going to be on a different, if you think about where they are in their journey, some people could have highly developed enterprise thinking on there and understand how you're thinking. And so they're much further along in the journey. And so you don't need to actually do a lot of mentoring and coaching of that individual. And so it is an important balance. I think it does take the time to assess where the folks on your team are and adjust your leadership style based on that. I would say, however, is if you're teaching and you're investing and over time we don't see the needle moving, then you begin to ask yourself, right, this is what we do as leaders. Okay, like this person, now I've created the space for them to do that. Now I've been mentoring and coaching, but I'm not actually seeing them be able to take and run with this independently. So do they actually have the ability to make the change? Do they actually have the competency to think at that level? And they may or may not be the right fit for, for a senior level role within your organization. So it's giving them the opportunity by coaching and mentoring. But if they're not able to adjust, then, you may have some decisions to make.
Yeah. Cara, do you have anything you would add there?
I would just point out that this is a polarity that we're talking about, which is this idea of showing people what to do and getting them to do it themselves or coaching them and how to do it. And it's a key leadership polarity for all people leaders. And just being aware of like, how much teaching do I do? And am I doing that to people who are high functioning, smart A players? Because they don't actually want to be taught. They want to be given a challenge and a way and find a way to figure it out. And how much am I coaching and asking the questions that will get people to solve and like building capacity and scaling my team in that way. But it's just another polarity.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And what comes up for me is the opportunity to have those rotational assignments where you really, because Cara, I don't know if you use this exact term, but I think all three of us have worked in learning and development at some point over our careers. Yes. Okay. That's a yes. And so we know that adults learn best experientially. That's why coaching and executive coaching is sought after over training after a certain level of our careers, because we just need to get in there and do it. But I want to come back, Dennis, your question for me, what comes up for me is that it should not be only the CEO's job to teach their team to think like them. It is a mutual endeavor. And I will say, in my experience, CEOs typically, the ones I've worked with over the years, their favorite part of their job is not the teaching and mentoring. Their favorite part of the job is solving business problems and being out in front and looking at themes and patterns and data and variables and making really hard decisions. And we want them there. So it's difficult. And again, this is in my own experience. I'm not saying this is true for all CEOs, but with the ones I've worked with, they mostly aren't conscious to slow down and say, well, let me tell you how I arrived at this decision. Here's how I reprioritized, and this is why we went in this direction. It is on the CEO to learn to look for those opportunities, especially if they need to develop bench strength inside of the organization and have a couple of number twos ready to go. But it is equally the C-suite's job and senior leadership's job to say, great, Sarah, CEO, can you slow down and just tell me how you arrived at that decision for my own learning? Great, what led us here? Why did we make this choice and not this one? It is a mutual job for that learning. And I would argue it may even be the CXO's job to drive their own learning and seek out what they need. So Dennis, I hope that's helpful. I think in terms of the balance of where our attention goes inside of and outside of organizations, we would want to put it back on the CXO to drive their own development, even when it comes to learning to think more like the CEO. So, Cara and Keisha, a couple more minutes. Could you share with us, in your experience, especially as you're coaching teams with Bright Arrow, how have you seen the executive team coaching experience leveraged as a way to teach teams to balance that enterprise and functional thinking a little better?
When I think about teams or functional leaders, again, we talked about the default is this deep domain functional thinking. Team coaching allows the team to have the white space on the calendar to leverage the brilliance of everyone that's in the room. And, thinking on that enterprise level. So, okay, like the finance person says this, the HR person says this. So really in the room, right, you are cultivating the experience and the time to actually understand interdependency, understand how there is impact, and you're not spending as much time as you were before working in silos. We default to the things that we're used to doing, and so the team coaching literally creates the space. The CEO is modeling that, but also the team coaches that are there are able to call it out. They model it themselves, and then they're able to highlight blind spots in how they're operating, ensuring that the structure that they have in place is supportive of the collaboration or collaborating environment that they want to create. So it's really just creating the space for them to do that.
Great. Thank you, Keisha. Cara, how about you?
What Keisha said.
Yeah.
Like teams that learn together just go so much farther together. Team coaching can be so great in terms of learning and getting stuff done at the same time while you're all together, and then having this little bit of accountability. I was just telling a friend this weekend about how I started working with a virtual strength coach. This guy I've never met, but somehow knowing that he's out there expecting me to do these workouts makes me just a little bit more likely to be completing these things. And there's something about a coach, knowing that your coach is out there and that they're going to ask you next time they see you, hey, what'd you do with that? How did that go?
Yeah. Beautiful. And this, I'll follow that up with our point on experiential learning is the way for senior leaders. Our engagements, as Keisha and Cara know, but for you listening, are set up so that they are delivering on their real goals while our coaches are in the room. So they are having to apply their practices of enterprise and functional thinking and balancing the two while we're there, helping to monitor for that to happen and challenging them if they get out of balance in one area versus another. Yeah, Keisha, did you have something, or you just agree?
No, I'm just agreeing. The experience, I think, highlighting that point in the moment. There's a neuroscientist called Rick Hansen. He talks about experience-based neuroplasticity. And I think a lot about this when, again, back to the habit of just thinking functionally. What I love that we do as coaches, our team coaches, is that, we're creating the space, and now we're helping you through accountability, through being in the room with you, develop these new habits. And habits don't change in a week or two. It takes 3. This is why our engagements are typically 6 months, because now you've learned the new habits. Now, how are we going to move it from the conscious to the subconscious? Kind of like driving, right? When you're a teenager, you learn to change the gears in the car, and you try to figure out how you're going to get where you're going to go. But by the time you're driving for 10 years, you're not thinking. Now it's second nature. And that's where we want to get the leaders to, that it now becomes enterprise thinking, now becomes second nature. And then they're able to weave in and out with that infinity loop between functional and enterprise.
Beautiful. Thank you. Well, I want to just spend the last few minutes we have here. I have one more question I'd love to get to you with Cara and Keisha, but if we don't have a lot coming in Q&A, we'll come back to that question. So I'd love to open the floor for those of you attending. If you have any questions, just pop them into the chat. We're happy to receive them. And we'll come back to answer those in these last couple of minutes. We are enjoying your thoughts in the chat. Thank you for sharing those and what's resonated with you. Angela, hey, thanks for coming. I'm glad the how did you get there resonated well with you. So while we wait for anything to roll in via the chat, Cara and Keisha, we've talked about the balance of power and responsibility in terms of driving our growth as enterprise and functional thinkers. I wonder, how do you see leaders get in their own way as they endeavor to develop in this area?
I think I'm thinking about one leader that I worked with. He was a C-suite member, and he was frustrated by his own team's accountability and follow through. And when we were talking about it, he felt like his two choices were either to do the work for his people or to get rid of his people. And so the conversation we had was about...
Would we call that a polarity, Cara, or is that a little out there? Okay, thank you.
That is a false binary, right? And so it led to this conversation where I was like, well, there's a whole lot of territory in between those two, right? Like, let's explore there. But his own kind of rigidity in how he was thinking about his options got in his way, because he was choosing between those two things. As opposed to, what if I presented this challenge to my team and we talked about what it is that's getting in the way of accountability, which, I mean, my hunch would have been that he was micromanaging them. And so they were just waiting because they knew that whatever he was going to bring them, he was going to end up doing. Whatever the problem is that you're seeing as a leader, you own part of it, and you have created it in some way. So, and the most leverage you'll get is through the piece that you own that way.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I think I've seen.
Well said. And Keisha, we're at time, so I'm going to close us. Keisha and Cara, thank you again. Attendees, we see you out there. Thank you so much for coming today. It's been awesome to see all of your interaction with us. And we have another opportunity coming up to be with us on June 26th at 11 a.m. Central. Our next webinar is on enriching your executive team's peer relationships. So today we just scratched the surface on the interactions of executive teams with their CEOs, with each other. We want to go a lot deeper on what does it take to really have your executive team humming, collaborating, managing conflict as they arise. We are no stranger to that work, and we would love to share our insights with you on June 26th. We will put the link for registration in the chat. Thank you again for joining us today, and we'll see you next month.
Bye, everyone. Take care.